Be read a second time. I call the member for Wills.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The arts is important to me, and I think it's important to all of us here. It's important to my community in my electorate of Wills. Firstly, because there are really so many talented local artists in my community. In fact, the suburb of Brunswick in my electorate has one of the highest concentrations of artists in all of Australia. But I think the arts is more than just that economic or that kind of concentration of workers, if you like, or those who work in the arts. It's really important. A thriving arts sector is actually really important because I think the arts are really the heart and soul of any society. They're the central core of any society. And they play a fundamental role in our community. The creativity that comes through the arts and the artists, they have the power to light up our cities, light up our suburbs, and the art can really take us to a place, take us out of our own time and space in some respects, so that we can reflect into other worlds, other perspectives, other human experiences, and also connections that I think are fundamental to being human. That's why the arts are so important. Art reaches the heart, it reaches the soul, but I think it also can reach the mind as well. If you look at the arts in Australia and the telling of Australian stories, for example, I worked at SBS before politics, and it was so important when we had NITV join SBS to be able to tell Indigenous stories so that Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians could see those stories told on the screen. When we tell Australian stories, we can see ourselves reflected back towards us. Now, and those unique Australian stories are special to us. All of these benefits that I've just outlined can't really be measured in traditional economic terms because there are no known metrics that can measure these intangibles, and they are intangibles in many respects because they're immeasurable in some respects doesn't mean they're not important. In fact, it actually means the sense that we have and we know that the benefits, whether they be social, economic, cultural, the benefits are actually invaluable to us as a society. That's why the arts matter. You can't measure it, you can't measure it in economic terms, but we actually know deep down that the impact it has on our lives and our society is actually invaluable. A society without the arts would not be a society. It would be something else that is alien to us. Throughout human history, it has been part of who we are as human beings. In my local electorate, I recently met with the co-CEO of Outer Urban Projects, Kate Gillick, and the General Manager, David Ralph. They're an impressive arts company in the Australian community. They do arts and cultural development in the performing arts sector. And they work to platform unheard voices, stories and the arts of the communities in the north of Melbourne. And as part of their work, they engage culturally diverse young people from low socioeconomic backgrounds within the performing arts. And they also offer free workshops to people who are newly arrived and disengaged educationally and or socially. They told me about a production called The Audition, which the audition shares powerful stories centred around what it means to be an asylum seeker. And it was inspired by two artists who were asylum seekers themselves, who developed and created the work. And the final shows were recently held as part of Refugee Week last week. Now, this production is just one example of the way in which the arts can also be a platform, an important platform for people in our community to have their voices heard as well, whether it be asylum seekers, refugees, whether it be those who are socioeconomically disadvantaged. They're able to share their thoughts, their emotions, their experiences in a more profound way, and in a sense, through the art itself, share what are elemental human experiences with us to connect, but also to open up perspectives and see the world in different ways. So I've said that the arts have always played such an important place in my electorate of Wills, and we saw that impact as well in respect of the impact that music and the arts had in keeping us somewhat united during COVID. What would it have been like during that COVID period in lockdowns if we didn't have some of the go-to arts and performances, especially with the kids around and all the rest of it, to keep us sane, I think, and our mental health, but also to keep us connected as human beings. It was a very difficult period. And when I said earlier that the arts are the heart and soul of any society, that came to the fore during that COVID period. It enriched our hearts and our souls and our minds in a very difficult period that people were struggling with and was challenged by. And during that challenging period, even though we went to the arts, the actual production of arts and artists, the output actually dropped significantly. Some 40% of artists had to find work in other areas just to survive. Half the sector were also concerned whether they even had a future at all, given what had happened to them, the impact. And even before the pandemic, artists have struggled financially. We know the kind of cliche of artists, poor artists who are, sacrificing everything for their work, and in a stroke of genius they might be able to sell a painting and suddenly become rich. That's the sort of Hollywood stereotypes. There are so many artists who are working artists who deserve, even in the best of times, to actually be paid a fair wage for the work that they do, given its significance and its impact on the community. But a lot of them, unfortunately, had to take multiple jobs just to make ends meet. And we saw a coalition of the coalition government for a decade sat on the Treasury benches there and consistently slashed funding for the arts. And I know those opposite who might support the arts might not want to hear this, but it's true. The arts community were neglected by the previous government. They scrapped Creative Australia after they came to power in 2013, and they replaced it with nothing. And for many years, artists had no supports in place. And our artists who contribute so much richness to our nation had simply not been respected for far too long, and that's just a fact. And this is why the Labor government, certainly when we were in opposition with the Shadow Minister at the time, Tony Burke, and now the Minister for the Arts, Tony Burke, the commitment and the passion to arts and to artists was so significant, because we value and elevate the contribution of the creative industries to Australia's social, cultural and economic life, because they're too important to be ignored. They're too important to be neglected. As I said, the invaluable contribution to our nation cannot be dismissed. That's the importance of it. Anyway, this bill, Deputy Speaker, specifically looks to further deliver commitments made by the Albanese Labor government in the new National Cultural Policy Revive. It's, I think, an appropriate word to use to describe the bill. This builds on the Albanese government's commitment to expand and modernise Creative Australia. And as part of this, we're establishing 4 new bodies: Music Australia, Creative Workplaces, First Nations Arts and Writing Australia. Music Australia and Creative Workplaces were set up last year. The First Nations body will commence this year in 2024, and Writing Australia will start in July next year. Now, the Albanese government respects the critical place of First Nations stories at the centre of our arts and our culture as well. That's why First Nations arts are placed as the first pillar of our new cultural policy. Art has been an important part of Indigenous cultures for over 65,000 years, and it's essential to the well-being, culture and identity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities. The First Nations body will support and promote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander arts practice. It will have its own board. They will have autonomy over the allocation of funds for investment in First Nations art, because the government does believe that First Nations art should be First Nations led. When I was working at SBS, as I mentioned, and NITV came on board, the importance of going out, I remember going out to the remote and regional parts of Australia and the cities of Australia to meet with Indigenous production companies, Indigenous artists who were working on film and television, and that was an important engagement, because it was about making sure that the Indigenous stories that were being told through the platform of NITV on the television were able to reach as many people as possible, so that people could understand, be educated, value, enjoy the Indigenous cultures and Indigenous storytelling, First Nations storytelling. And I think that continues from strength to strength today at NITV. Writing Australia, Deputy Speaker, will be a new body that supports and promotes the Australian literature sector, helping to support authors, illustrators and publishers to create new works. Again, the point about telling Australian stories is of critical importance, and that includes writers authors, illustrators, to be able to tell the uniquely Australian stories. And yes, there's great literature around the world that we can all access, obviously, but when we're talking about the market and economics versus the invaluable contribution that the arts makes, for me, the arts are not just an economic sector. It's too important just to measure it just by the economics. A lot of people say, oh, well, look, we can make an argument that more people go to the NGV than the MCG. That's great. But not all arts are commercially viable. That doesn't mean they're not important. Not all stories are going to sell millions of copies. That doesn't mean they are not important and unique and valuable and play a role within our society. And frankly, as a Social Democrat, I actually believe that the government has a role to play in not just supporting, but creating the conditions of support for those stories to be told, even if they're not commercially viable. The government plays a role in supporting artists in that respect, because otherwise some of those stories would not be told. They would disappear. And they're important for us as Australians. The Writing Australia will enable investment in a network of organisations that allow the development of national industry initiatives that increase national and international markets for Australian stories as well, for writers. So the government recognises that new technology is disrupting the environment for writers. We understand that. And government policy needs to be modernised to better support these artists given this disruptive period. So both Writing Australia's establishment and the First Nations body are part of that larger plan when it comes to the arts. Since we launched Revive, Deputy Speaker, the government have established Creative Australia to modernise arts funding, reverse what were known as the Brandis cuts at the time. And I say this again, I know this is a partisan place, but again, the point that the arts are not just some special plaything of, it's not like the De Medicis here where you could just pick, if you love ballet, that's all you're going to fund. It doesn't work. It shouldn't work that way. It should work in a way where artists and performing artists and writers and visual artists and others are supported right across the board by government with independent sources of funding and not just favoured based on the particular interests of one particular political leader or other, or the government itself. Establishing creative workplaces to improve the standards and safety of workers in the arts is important. We've established Music Australia, as I said. We're sharing the National Collection, so art is shared with regional and suburban galleries and getting out to the regions, which is important. We've extended the lending rights so Australian writers are better paid. Again, going back to those conditions and fair pay and for work rights for artists as well. We've boosted funding for performing arts training organisations, and we've provided more support for games developers through Screen Australia as well, and improved tax breaks for the video games industry as well, which is part of the creative industry. And we've increased funding to Sounds Australia to unlock international opportunities for our musicians who are very, very successful. Tones and I was here the other day. She's had 3 billion, I think, hits on Spotify or whatever it was, which is kind of a remarkable figure, given that, she started out in Frankston. I remember going out to Frankston. I was scared to go out to Frankston a lot of the time. It was a pretty rough neighbourhood. It's very nice now on the beach, but a great success story out of, a tough socio-economic area where you get this wonderful success of an Australian artist like Tones and I. Deputy Speaker, the government has a history of backing artists, backing the arts. The last two cultural policies were delivered under Labor governments. It was Creative Nation under Paul Keating and Creative Australia under Julia Gillard. Art has a powerful way of letting us experience the world around us through a different lens, as I said, the different perspectives. And it gives, and artists and their art give us so much to our community and about who we are. And we need to make sure that we give something back to the artists who are doing this work, this important creative work for our society. And this bill outlines the Albanese government's commitment to improving the quality of investment into the arts. The bill is going to ensure artists and art organisations have greater supports. And the government is truly committed to bringing back respect and real, tangible support to our artists and to the arts sector. Thank you.
The question is